Welcome to this eighth class in this extended series, Delivered into Covenant, Pivotal Moments in the Book of Exodus, Part 2 by Walter Brueggemann. As I said, we're going through Chapter 8, the eighth class, and this one is entitled The Dwelling Emancipator. And the pivotal text for our focus today is Exodus 29, verses 45 through 46. This week's chapter feels like a companion chapter to last week's, and many of you missed last week's, although I did see that some of you watched the recording, so you may be in the loop. But just in case you haven't had the chance to catch up, last week we talked about rites, rituals, and practices we put into place to help us come to a better understanding of God's holiness and otherness. You see to the right an illustration that I used last week where this bizarre ritual was described, whereby the priest would be sanctified and set apart as holy and a fit conduit for God's message and for the rituals and practices that would bring God near the people. And so I said this ritual is bizarre, and it is. They rub blood from a sacrificed lamb on the right earlobe, the right toe, and where else? There was another place, the hem of maybe perhaps the thumb, the ear, the thumb, and the toe. And we made the point last week that the bizarreness of the ritual isn't the point so much as there is a ritual that designates holy spaces. There's similar rituals that would designate altars as holy, the tabernacle is holy, later the temple is holy, and other things as well. And we considered how such rituals can shore us up in an age of constant flux and change. They assume a holy and other God who will always find ways to exist with and be embodied in our communities of faith. And our religious rituals and practices can provide continuity between our past and present. So we don't have to make up the rituals wholesale and find new meaning for new rituals in each and every generation. It can be passed on, and beliefs about God can be transmitted, and stories can be transmitted in this way. And these rituals and practices can then sit outside of modern trends and fashions to keep us anchored in a reality beyond our corporeal experience. And some humans need rituals and traditions, and God draws near to us by way of them, or can draw near to us by way of them. In today's chapter is about how we can maintain order and rituals, as we described last week, in our faith practices, but without limiting the scope of God's liberative action in the world. And so towards the end of last week's lesson, you may recall that we had a conversation about how many of our modern faith communities lack the rituals, the timeless rituals that will transmit beliefs from generation to generation, and also in competition with the marketing practices of our consumer culture, we have created new rituals, but they seem transient and in flux. And from the words we say to the songs we sing, they are always changing. And so we talked about the benefits of having entrenched practices and rituals that do not change, that remain fixed to bring God near the people. This week's lesson, as I said, is a companion lesson, and it is to help us with the to see that too much of that is not a good thing. Rituals that are too entrenched, beliefs about God that are too fixed, that cannot be held up for consideration, can keep us from understanding God, who is active and alive and moving and bringing change into the world. So on with the chapter. As I said, the pivotal verse is Exodus 29, 45 through 46, which reads, "I will dwell among the Israelites, and I will be their God. And they shall know that I am the Lord their God, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, that I might dwell among them. I am the Lord their God." Brueggemann selected this as the pivotal text because it helps the reader reconcile a tension between two extremes that we've been loosely talking about, two different expressions of God's presence in the world. The tension held in today's text is described well by Brueggemann on page 95 of the ebook version, which I have, so it may be a different page in yours. But I quote, "The contrast could hardly be more stark between a God of active intervention, as we read about during chapters 1 through 24 of the Exodus narrative, where God came down from the heavens and busted the people out of Egypt and then sojourned with them up to this point. So the contrast could hardly be more stark between that God and a God of serene indwelling. which we read about through the remainder of these chapters, as describes the practices of worshiping this God that will dwell and be ensconced, enmeshed with the people. It is, going on with the quote, a most interesting and perhaps most difficult question of how we are to understand and adjudicate these two articulations of God. They clearly represent two quite different textual trajectories, two different interpretive horizons, and likely two different historical circumstances. It is our inclination to prefer one of these articulations to the other, whether we are more inclined to word or sacrament, to high church or low church, to Protestant or Catholic, to transformation or equilibrium. And this is, I hope probably you've become used to talking about the Bible in this way, but to acknowledge that there are different narrative traditions that posit different images of God and even different beliefs about God, or emphasize different beliefs about God over others. And he makes the point that these two traditions are even noticeable in the book of Exodus, one what we think of as a cohesive book, but containing two traditions, where at the first half of the book, you've got a God that is very earthy and moves and responds and is active and vibrant in the world. And then you've got another God that seems to just want to sit in the tabernacle or in the temple and just be in a place in a fixed location with very defined rules for engaging this God, call them rituals, practices, and very defined descriptions of this God. So this pivotal text is selected by Brueggemann because he believes we can hold these two pictures of God, the God of serene indwelling and the God of active intervention. We can hold them not only in tension, but in a complementary way. This next paragraph basically says what I just said, that he selected this because it holds well the tension between these two religious impulses. God will dwell among the people and even insist upon an order to the community where God takes up residence, which we talked about at length last week. But God will not be confined to the order that is established there. The same God who could not be contained during chapters 1 through 24 of Exodus will dwell with the people, but not in such a way that inhibits God's liberating activity in the world. In other words, God isn't going to dwell among the people to retire. The word used to describe God's residence with the people, which we translate as dwell, or will dwell among you in today's pivotal text, is tricky. That's the word that Brueggemann uses for it. And he suspects that this is intentional. Quoting him, "It does not mean to dwell finally, absolutely, and permanently." The Israelites had another verb for that, and I'm not going to try to pronounce it because I'm not sure how. But there's another verb for an indwelling that is permanent that's used in 1 Kings 8 through 13. That verse reports a more palpable notion of divine presence in the cult than is promised in our verses. Here, the verb means to dwell provisionally, to sojourn, to bivouac, to stay and then to leave, rather like a nomad. And so I have to write a picture of something like what the tent of tabernacle would look like. And you notice that it's canvas. It doesn't give you the impression of a permanent dwelling. That's in keeping with the sense in which God is going to dwell among the people. This is fixed and has physical location, but you get the idea that God might need to pack up tent and do something else with the people, move somewhere else. Going on with the quote, "Elsewhere in a divine protest against a temple, Yahweh resists a temple and refuses to give up freedom and mobility as a God who has been moving about." You can read about that God description in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 6. There are traditions that want to lock Yahweh in as a patron, but not here. See Ezekiel 44, verses 1 through 2. Here, in today's text, the place of divine dwelling must be open and porous enough for divine freedom, exactly the intent of the noun tabernacle, which is contrasted to the temple and is sometimes translated as a verb, to tent, or as in, "we're tenting tonight." So he's going at great lengths to describe the sense in which Yahweh will dwell amongst the people. And the point seems to be that word emphasis on the word porous, this backwards and forwards, God dwelling with, but then moving out when God is called to action. The impulse behind today's pivotal text is to synthesize two religious sensibilities that can otherwise be held in contention. Or to quote Brueggemann again, "In this utterance, God and the tradition have brought together the God of the narrative of transformative agency, chapters 1 through 24, and the God of serene sovereignty, the back half of Exodus. True, God is holy, and God's holiness should be revealed symbolically by way of rites and rituals. What's more, these rites and rituals should take place in holy places, in temples and upon altars set aside for the purpose. As Brueggemann points out, the God of the Exodus and the God housed in the tabernacle is one and the same. But the God who has made a dwelling among the people cannot be contained by order. Another quote, "It is easy enough to imagine that the God who dwells in the beauty of holiness is quiet and passive. But think at that line, quiet and passive, think like heraldic church music, the oh sort of thing. Contrasting that with, like, say, a charismatic church service where everything seems sort of up for open expression." To continue on with the quote, "You may think that God who dwells in the beauty of holiness is quiet and passive, but no, this is the God who emancipates. We are able to see why Yahweh resists being captive in a cultic apparatus, why this God goes to and fro. This is a God who is drawn to the cries of the destitute, who hears and honors such cries and goes where there is suffering. This is what happened in the Exodus narrative. God from somewhere on a glorious throne, perhaps in some safe sanctuary, had departed such a place in response to the cries of the slaves and acted for them." See Exodus 2, verses 23 through 25. Clearly, such a divine departure from serenity to historical engagement on behalf of the destitute is no one-time deal. It is a characteristic act of this God. The tradition imagines a God who is in motion, always going from sanctuary to confrontation and back to sanctuary. If we insist upon the strictest adherence to certain rites, rituals, ecclesial structures, worship styles, or order, then we will limit the scope of our experiences of God. We will come to think that we can control God when God shows up, and in what ways. When this happens, religious institutions and communities miss God's movement in other diverse places, stagnate, and get stuck in a rut. Contrast this with the opposite impulse, where worship and religious life is less focused, routinized, unpredictable, and less routinized, unpredictable, and less focused. I have visited religious communities where it seemed as though everything was up in the air in regards to worship styles, what was expected of God, and even what we believed about God. In short, rituals and doctrine were up for grabs. Both of these extremes inhibit our understanding of God and God's actions in the world. God is both active and dwells with the people. Jews and Christians have learned these lessons again and again as they've had to adapt to trying times. When the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, 586 BCE, and then again by the Romans, 70 CE, the Jewish people discovered that the God who once tabernacled/made a dwelling among the people did not abandon them. In fact, God never abandoned them and continued to abide with them to see them through the centuries. Through the centuries, Christians have understood God's abiding presence by way of our understanding of Jesus, who has been understood as both human and divine. In his person is a fusion of the messiness of humanity and the perfected order of a holy God. In the person of Jesus, we conceive of a God who leaves the order of heaven for the disordered and unpredictable order of earth. Here, Jesus is mirroring the God we meet in Exodus 2, who hears the cries of the people, breaks with order, and responds in force. Today's pivotal text insists that God is with the people, but will not remain still. God is with the people, and God is also actively working to liberate the peoples of the earth. God will not be contained by our rituals or in our buildings, and yet we do need order in our worship and some form to our religious life. The tension between the God of extreme order, God of serene sovereignty, and a God who moves and is not constrained by rules and order, with the God of transformative agency, remains with us. Brueggemann touched on this earlier when he mentioned Christian traditions that may gravitate to one extreme or the other. Word versus sacrament. In other words, churches that emphasize preaching or reading the Bible or the doctrines of the faith over the sacraments of the faith. So Protestants classically are seen as emphasizing the word over sacrament. Some Protestant traditions try to synthesize the two. And then you have some traditions like the Catholic and the Orthodox who elevate sacrament over word. You have the dichotomy of high church and low church. High church meaning those ones with more entrenched rituals that are written down from the onset, and the priest or the pastor will more or less lead the congregation through those things, versus a low church model, which our church somewhere straddles the line where we have some order, but you could also see us having some adaptability in our service compared to other churches. And I hate to even use the word low church to describe these because it seems pejorative, but what's usually meant is a church that has less form and order. So maybe even like a charismatic church where people are running the aisles. So and you could take it to ultimate extremes like, snake handling churches and things like that. And then I guess what we're talking about here roughly is Protestant versus Catholic, the terms in North America that have become most associated with these two sorts of modes of religious expression within Christianity. And then broadly speaking, the difference between transformation versus equilibrium. So Protestants have seen themselves as transformation movements, or part of a transformation movement to transform the church, to adapt it to its times, or to reclaim what has been lost, versus a tradition that seeks to maintain its doctrines, its beliefs, its practices. Why people were unsettled when Vatican I gave way to Vatican II, and people began to, use other languages besides Latin in the Mass. Disturbing equilibrium. That would be like the church that kind of churches that prefer equilibrium. So this chapter is trying to hold these two extremes together, not in tension, but to harmonize them. And even given these alleged dichotomies, there may exist a tendency to limit our perceptions of God and the scope of God's transformative power, which is my way of saying whichever extreme you fall to, you're going to lose something. To quote Brueggemann again, much contemporary worship is over-routinized in a way whereby God becomes predictable, domesticated, and accommodated to our preferred patterns. When the routinization and domestication happen by liturgical habit, by preferred morality, by practiced piety, by certain orthodoxy, God is cut off from God's narrative. Mm-hmm. This is a warning to those of us who think that we have maybe cracked the code in our worship. We think of ourselves as not stuffy, over-ritualized Christians. But what ends up happening in every tradition is even if you develop new practices and new ways of understanding God, those too become entrenched in time. And so you end up with religious structures and institutions that are as immovable and as stagnant as often the movements they branch out of that they are trying to critique. And so what becomes contemporary worship becomes old, or kind of like what we now think of as classic rock, which when I was growing up was old rock songs, what used to be current rock songs. And you can see how religion can become stagnant if we forget that the God who dwells with us in our sanctuaries and in our religious communities is also the same God that insists that the dwelling is temporary and can be up and moved should the circumstance call for that. Today's pivotal text gives us a middle way, one that assumes order, but acknowledges that in moments in time, God will bust out of and work around our labels and traditions to liberate and redeem the human race. Do we hold these expectations in our own churches? I confess there have been many a sleepy, ordered Sunday when I turned up to church with low expectations. Here is not the mindset of someone who believes they are convening at church to meet with the God who liberated the people from Egypt, much less the God that called Jesus back from the dead. Brueggemann's quote of Annie Dillard is most fitting to close, and I quote, "It is outrageous to wear ladies' straw hats and velvet hats to church. We should all be wearing crash helmets. Ushers should issue life preservers and signal flares. They should lash us to our pews. For the sleeping God may wake someday and take offense, or the waking God may draw us out to where we can never return." I find that a very sobering statement, to think that the God that dwells with the people in the tabernacle, but also leads the people as a column of fire and liberates the people from Egypt, brought Jesus back from the dead, called the church into being, the same God that did those things is supposed to be meeting with us, tabernacling with us in a pretty open-ended way when we meet in church on Sunday. And if we could remember that when we walked into the sanctuary, I feel like our experience of church would be different. So I bring it back. Before we move into questions and comments, I just want to say the next class will be next week. We're going to be going back into a regular cycle of meeting every week to get some continuity, to return to some continuity. We spent too much time, too much time without that. So 25th of August, same time. It's a Thursday, 2:00, going over chapter 9, the recovering self. I accidentally left the last, it's called the recovering self. I left the chapter title for this one in there on accident. I bring this back. I'm going to stop sharing. There we go. Hello. Your thoughts, your comments, your observations.
Yeah. I found this very hard to follow, actually.
Yeah, I'm glad you went through it, Heath, because I was missing the point at first. I mean, you got the point, but I was really going in a different direction when I was first reading this. And so, yeah, I understand now what he was getting at. I mean, Annie Dillard's quote, kind of brought it home, but there was a statement he made that was like, wow, we could not have expected that the God who is preoccupied with suitable cultic holiness is the Lord of the Exodus. And I'm thinking, why not? I mean, these were the folks who were saying he was telling Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, there's only one God, get rid of all those other false gods. There's just one God. So why is Brueggemann saying we could not have expected that the God who is preoccupied with suitable cultic holiness is the Lord of the Exodus? Why would these people be thinking that there were two different gods? I mean, in my mind, it's a little bit difficult to understand why God was so hard on the Egyptian people. I mean, I understand that he didn't like the way his people were being treated. I mean, slavery is terrible, and the Pharaoh's heart was hardened over and over and over again. So there was a lot of vengeance and wrath involved there. So for me, the question is really the conflict between God who takes power, takes his power and uses it for warlike purposes, and then a God of peace. I mean, that conflict was kind of in my mind when I first started reading this. But in the end, it's really about where is God, and I don't know. So I was very confused about where he was going with all this. But I was missing the point. I was missing his point.
Well, he didn't do a good job in this chapter, or even the last chapter where he talked more about it in describing, making the clear distinctions between two literary traditions about God in the Torah and throughout the Hebrew writings, where you have a priestly tradition. That's a lot of what we're dealing with here in the back half of Exodus is priestly material. Oh, Sue Osborne was in and now she left. Did I not let her in? Is that what happened? I hope not. Oh, here she goes.
That happened to me last week. When I came back, I couldn't get in.
Well, I'm letting her in now. But in the priestly tradition, it's almost as if they're trying to contain God in dimensions, in rules, in parameters. You have to have so many things in place to make it to make the space acceptable, the priest acceptable, the offering acceptable. And so in that model, it seems to point towards a God that is very rigid, very defined, and inflexible. Contrasted with the God that we meet at the first half of the book of Exodus and in other parts where God is walking in the garden in Genesis or coming down from heavens. So it's a God, is it a God that is entrenched in ritual, or has is the kind of house that God lives in made of marble because it never moves? And he's making he's pointing to the significance of it being a tabernacle, which is both God dwelling with, but also adaptable. So it synthesizes the God that we met in the first half of the book of Exodus, with other perceptions we might derive from God if we only consider the writings about proper order and ritual. And you see those, so that's, but there are other contrasting God images, and that's what you've noticed, which is between a peaceful God and a violent God, which is a different contrast in what this chapter is talking about. But I think a lot of the confusion is when he quickly moves past a statement like in that quote that you read, where he quickly just names the God of early Exodus with the God. Read it again. That
quote, and it even starts the chapter that way. But this was further on in the chapter. This is an extraordinary and somewhat surprising affirmation. We could not have expected that the God who is preoccupied with suitable cultic holiness is the Lord of the Exodus.
So you didn't talk enough about that right there. Certainly.
Yeah, but it really kind of starts out that way. This God is celebrated as a man of war. That was in the very beginning.
It seemed to me like this was trying to limit the sovereign God that I worship. I mean, God has so many attributes. Here we're talking about whether he's militaristic or whether he's kind, or, I mean, he fits in what's needed as far as I'm concerned. And he can be anything that he wants, and he can be two things at once at the same time. You know, he's God. He's overall, he's, omnipotent, all those adjectives that go along with it. And I just didn't get the point of why. I mean, he was trying to bring them out, and he was moving with them and camping with them and that sort of thing. And then he wants them to worship him. And it just seemed to me like it just followed a sequence,
Yeah. So why was it so surprising? There's
That's
just
the way
one
I
God.
looked at it.
So, I mean, and it's a mystery. So maybe it's up to us to try to understand, but there's just one God. So I don't know. And he could be in many places. And
well, it seems to, it just occurred to me that it seems hard to believe that people who had experienced all of the things that happened in leaving Egypt, all of those plagues, and the crossing the sea, and then were in the wilderness and had their needs provided for, like manna and quail and whatever. Suddenly it seems like they divert and want to worship other idols, and they need some they need a tabernacle, they need some kind of ritualistic presence, because the rest wasn't enough.
Something to focus on. So they didn't have, if they want to make their idols from the past life, what they need now is, because they had images that they could look at, and the but I tell you, I got turned off right away. I'm sorry, I don't know what about that. The assumption of this text, is that God is utterly holy, of a different quality and character from anything in ordinary life. Well, yeah. Why are we assuming?
Yeah.
I didn't get it.
He's trying to say that the assumption of the person who wrote today's pivotal verse assumes that God, but also an additional component to a God that is not only a holy other but dwells with us. Just he was trying to clearly state that, and there is a way of seeing God that's sometimes reflected in the Bible where God is so other and so holy and so distinct, that God is inaccessible. And he's trying to say that this community is trying to conceive of a God who is that holy and distinct and other, but also dwells with them, but not in such a way that makes the God immobile and incapable of acting outside of the interests of the people that God's dwelling with, or outside of even the rituals and practices that the people develop along with God to understand God, is the point. So the Brueggemann wasn't trying to state what he assumed about God as if we needed to hear that, but just trying to clearly state that the author of this text assumes that, in addition to dwelling with, which is, I think, reconciling those two ideas as God is other but also with us is what the chapter is really trying to do. Roll your eyes. I don't know. That's the best I can explain it. Say more, Sue, if it bothers you.
I don't know.
How are you? I'm sorry you came in late. Well, I'm not sorry. I noticed you came.
We had no email from today.
Really?
Jay's been working on the internet because we have 4 people now that are trying to be on a lot of the time at the same time. And it was doing funny things and everything. So Jay thought he had everything fixed. And I called Sherry and she sent it to me again, but I never got it. And finally Jay came in. He says, I guess I got to put the password in every day. And I said, well, you don't have to show me about that. He had to go back and teach class. So I don't know. I'm very frustrated with the whole thing. Things didn't work yesterday. And anyway, so yeah, that's why I'm late. I'm sorry. So
it's okay.
We're sorry. We missed you.
Yeah. Did he talk about the thumb and the toe and
that was last week's.
That was last week's? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Down to the priest, down to the tippy toes.
Yeah. Okay.
Last week's lesson was real hopeful, as far as we discussed, the different kinds of traditions, like the ones that are really liturgical and, don't really feature a single, leadership role of the pastor in worship, that is mostly reciting all of these, I don't know, canons all these ritualistic things. And then the other side is the one that's, the Protestant view and where the pastor has more importance and there's less of that liturgy. And some people really need that liturgy and others don't gravitate toward that. I don't know.
This, I said at the onset, today's chapter was a companion to that chapter, and that last week was not trying to enclose God in the rituals and in the traditions, but trying to make the point that what's being described here is maybe a ritual we're not about to start up, where we rub blood on our ears and do all of those things, but it's something that is to give rhythm in a cyclical practice that whereby which the people can come to understand where God meets them, and how they can worship. And the tendency can be, and has happened throughout the course of history and religions broadly speaking, is we can take these rituals and these traditions and they can become so codified and then also inflexible, that when in new times and new places, we need to make some changes, maybe to the rituals, maybe just change the language, for instance, or some other things that maybe are lost in translation. Sometimes religious communities have trouble with that. And today's chapter is meant to say, well, of course, because the God that these rituals are housing moves, sometimes up and leaves heaven to liberate the people, or works through prophets and Jesus to make, to bring God's presence near to the people. And so today was to just remind us that God is holy and other, and we need the rituals and the practices, but the houses we build for God, metaphorically speaking here, must be thought of more like the tabernacle tent that was meant to move as the people needed to move, as opposed to something that's, locked in stone, timeless, and almost like the final statement about God. That's the general idea. I'm finding different ways of trying to describe it, because my sense is this chapter confused most of us. And I had confession, I had to read it like 3 times. And I'm only taking Brueggemann's, I'm not sure, along with what you said, Judy, and what you said, Janet, and probably you too, Sue, is that these two ideas are really as in conflict with one another as he's making them out to be. He's the biblical scholar, so maybe he's aware of a longer debate within the text that went on centuries about, the God who's only in the temple versus the God who moves. I don't know, but this is another example, I think, of.
So when I think about the temple, and for years, all the way down to David, they just had the temple. That's a lot of years. And God never said, I need something better than a temple. And I think when it comes to holy places, it's holy if we make it holy. And so I guess the temple's not that important to me as a spirit is of the worship is more important than the building or the temple. I saw some beautiful cathedrals when I was in Europe, and but do they really? Are they just a beautiful cathedral, or is there real worship there for God?
Or was it made a spiritual place because of all the worship that happened there? I think it's inspirational. And so people came and worshiped there. And I think that the spirit came into that place because of, I don't know. I think that's why. But out of the hymn, surely the presence of the Lord is in this place. I love that hymn. And it's about the people, right, who are there, the spirit coming upon them, right? Isn't that what it's about?
Mm-hmm.
I remember way back years ago. It's always a continual problem with children, in worship, and they were acting up, and and I remember John Hinnett said one of our goals should be to instill respect for the holy.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it was kind of a lofty goal. Anyway, you've got 4th graders and 5th graders, but that just flashed into my mind that there is something holy about, being in worship. And even if you don't have rituals or you don't have a fancy, surrounding like a cathedral in Europe, there is something else that's present.
Yeah, it's just a matter of respect. You could be anywhere, but if you respect the rules or whatever is asked of you,
Well, thank you for this coming Sunday, the sermon really complements what we're talking about here, and it just happened to be that way as I wrote the sermon before I really dove into this text, and so I'll be curious to see if maybe we can have more clarity even then after the sermon. I think that we're of accord here. I just think that sometimes, well, I don't want to. I'm with you about this book. Some chapters I really enjoy, and others I find less helpful. I'll just say that. I'm determined to get through it, but that's because we're so far. We've made it this far.
Connie, can I just ask, you were the first, I think you were the first person that started us off saying it was confusing. Did you have any more to say about that? Because I think I jumped right in.
No. I'm just listening to everybody's input, and I still think I find it confusing.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure we weren't ignoring you.
Oh, no, I'm good.
Okay. All right. Sorry.
It's all right.
But
Well, thank you for this time. And sorry we got such a little short time with you, Sue. I'd like to conclude with prayer. I know that's not what we typically do, but I feel led in the moment, and we'll send you off that way. We all pray with me. Almighty God, I pray a blessing on this group, and we thank you for the time that we had together as we move forward week to week and continue to think about these things. I pray that your Spirit will guide our discussions and give clarity where there's confusion, and insight and novel ideas where we need them. I pray that the important part of today's lesson will stick with us, that you are a God who moves and liberates, but also dwells near with us and stays with us. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
thank you.
Blessings. Go with God, and I'll see you all soon.
Okay.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.